So this class, we're going to continue what we kind of started on in the last couple of classes. Last class, we spent a lot of time talking about global trade and be that in labor, in money, capital, or commodities. And the thing is we kind of treated that as like trade happening in a vacuum, but just like all markets, global markets need certain institutions to support market exchange. And so this class we're going to spend talking about kind of governance of global markets in each of these kind of categories, in labor, in capital, and in commodities. So just to outline where we're heading, we're going to start with something called the globalization trilemma that gives you kind of a really simple but powerful way of thinking about the trade-offs of globalization, talking about different arenas of globalization, the institutions of global trade, both kind of the old ones and the new ones, and kind of how we transitioned from the post-war order to what we have in contemporary days. A little bit of bringing in the real world of what trade and wages look like as a consequence of globalization and the governance of global markets, international monetary systems, and then finally a few kind of closing thoughts on globalization before we kind of move on to other topics next class. So let's start with the institutions that support international trade. So all markets require institutions to support trade. In the simplest sense, we can think about this as the fundamental problem of exchange. If we're like isolated individuals in kind of this fantasy state of nature that just like meet in the woods, and you have a deer and I have some berries, and we would like to trade parts of that with parts of each of what we have with the other, the fundamental problem of exchange is that there are no consequences for simply you walking over, hitting me over the head, and taking my berries without exchanging anything. And so we need rules to govern exchange. These things can be formal rules, like what exist in most of our interactions in the market, in our day-to-day lives, and also in the international sphere. But they can also be informal norms that kind of develop over time naturally. But in the global context and globalization, these institutions are definitely going to be formal, and they're going to be large, multilateral institutions made up of a bunch of different countries making agreements with each other. Now, it's always important to remember that the policies that regulate international trade, whatever sort of trade that it happens to be regulating, that always has consequences for domestic policy, and that should always be kept in mind. And so this trilemma here is one way of kind of organizing the trade-offs that are at hand. So at each point in the triangle, we have one thing. So hyperglobalization, democratic politics, or national sovereignty. And we can only pick two. We can never obtain all three. Because, for instance, by nature of picking national sovereignty and democratic policies, we're not going to be able to achieve a hyperglobalization, because democratic policies at home will be at odds with a hyperglobalization, right? Like people at home will want to protect domestic markets, for instance. And we can't have hyperglobalization and democratic politics because hyperglobalization requires some compromises to be made with national policy. And so the only way we can get democracy with hyperglobalization is if we have global democracy, right? And so on. But the most important and relevant for our discussion today is the golden straitjacket, the selection of hyperglobalization with national sovereignty. And that is essentially where we've landed today, that democratic policies at home have become kind of secondary to the concerns of hyperglobalization and national sovereignty. So we'll talk about kind of where we came from, which is the bottom of the trilemma, the Bretton Woods Compromise. And the final side of the triangle, the global governance, is purely aspirational or speculative. It's not something that's ever really existed in reality. So this is one way of thinking about globalization, but this is a different kind of organizing principle are the arenas of economic globalization. And I like to break it up as globalization of trade in goods and services, capital, and labor. And these are going to be what I would call the primary areas that we are concerned about as economists. Now, it's important to always remember that there are other processes of globalization that are going on that are less economic. That is not to say they're non-economic, they're just less economic. There's a globalization of the environment that's clearly taking place with the immense challenge of climate change. Culture has become far more free-flowing between each nation. Technology and governance. So all of these things are, in many other arenas as well, globalization is occurring. And in those, economists should still be concerned and should still look at them, but they are not what I would call primarily economic. But it's important to remember that globalization is far more than an expansion in global trade. It's a transformational process that changes the way humanity relates to itself. And it touches kind of almost every aspect of human formal institutions. So, moving from those kind of organizational schemes, let's kind of dig into the history of it a bit. As I've spoke about in previous classes, the First and Second World Wars were really, in large part, the result of a breakdown of global institutions, of both trade and governance. And there was a concerted effort after the Second World War to rebuild all of the institutions that had failed to put us on a firmer footing that would kind of foster both trade and peace. So these new institutions had to deal with this tension that we've already highlighted between domestic policy concerns and international trade. And the decision was made to go for a limited globalization. If you think back to the trilemma, they gave up hyper-globalization, got a limited globalization, and were able to retain national sovereignty and democratic policies. So what does that look like in practice? Well, there were capital controls, which essentially means that governments could prevent firms from moving money in and out of countries. They could do this in terms of quotas, of rates, of taxes. There are a bunch of different ways that countries were able to implement this sort of policy. But by and large, countries regulated the flow of capital in and out of them. And what this does is it allows greater freedom for macroeconomic policy. So, for instance, if you have a nation with a bunch of private firms, as most nations have, and that nation engages in a high degree of Keynesian stimulus program. So they just do a bunch of government spending, they increase social safety net, all of these sorts of policies. Firms may want to move their capital outside of the country because they are concerned that they will be taxed more in the future on their expected future profits to pay for these programs. They also might have concerns about the bargaining power they have with labor as a result of, like, if the economy's running at a lower unemployment rate, then workers have relatively more power in the wage bargain. And so these are all concerns that firms might have that may want them to kind of let their capital flee to another country. But capital controls in the post-war era were able to kind of prevent this behavior. And so there was a great deal of Keynesian macroeconomic management during that time. This limited globalization also put into place a number of very important exceptions to free trade for developing nations. So this is where you get nations that were, like South Korea, for instance, that were able to develop very quickly because they were allowed these exceptions to free trade. They were allowed infant industry protections and to ignore some patent protections. And so this is kind of the order that was established by the Bretton Woods system. Just kind of a brief historical note, the Bretton Woods system is called that because it was hashed out at a resort in, I believe, Vermont called Bretton Woods by Keynes and a number of kind of very prominent economists and policymakers of the era. And in practice, we'll get to the monetary aspects of it later in this lecture. So the Bretton Woods system was kind of trying to build all of these institutions. And one aspect of it was the establishment of an organization called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT. And so that's how the Bretton Woods system dealt with the globalization of goods and services, that kind of first arena. And all the GATT was a series of agreements to lower tariffs and lift import quotas. Importantly, all of these agreements were multilateral. That means everyone in the agreement had to be treated the same. So if, keep it simple, we've got like the US, the UK, and Germany are, say, our only actors here. That meant that the US and Germany can't make a deal that excludes the UK. They can't say, all right, well, we'll lower tariffs for German goods, but not for British goods. No. Under the GATT, everyone had to treat each other the same, and that was called the most favored nation status. So if everyone had to give everyone else most favored nation status. So the GATT was extremely successful in negotiating lowerings of tariffs and liftings of quotas. It was somewhat less successful in enforcing compliance with the agreements. It had this formal negotiation process that was very strong, but its judicial process was very weak. In essence, what had to happen was if a country accused another country of violating one of the agreements of GATT, it went to the whole assembly of all member nations, and all nations had to unanimously vote, including the nation being accused, essentially that they were guilty and could be sanctioned, which in practice meant that the judicial process just was completely non-functional in the GATT. It just was never used because it was hopeless to work. Because one person, including the accused, could simply stop the whole thing in its tracks. So, GATT was, like I said, GATT was largely successful, but this success in large part can be attributed to high growth for most nations during that period. So basically, put yourself in the post-war era. The US is the factory of the world because basically everyone else is a less developed country that doesn't have much industrial capacity, or they're a country that was devastated and had all their capital smashed in the Second World War. So the US became just the factory of the world, exporting capital everywhere. And so this meant the US got very high growth rates because they were exporting a lot of things to a bunch of different people. And the rest of the world was just rebuilding their factories and engaging in a lot of development expenditure, which led to very high growth rates there. So the distributional consequences of freer trade were easier to swallow because everyone's slice of the pie was growing. And so even if their shares were kind of shifting around, like we talked about in the last class, it's easier to swallow because in absolute terms, everyone's income is growing. Put this in contrast to today, where, for instance, in the US, the median annual income for a worker has basically been flat since the late 70s. It makes the distributional consequences somewhat harder to swallow. So keep that in mind. One name that was given to this kind of limited globalization or this moderate globalization was called embedded liberalism. This is alluding to the idea of embeddedness that comes to us from an economist or an economic anthropologist by the name of Karl Polanyi. And basically the idea is the economic system initially serves social functions. It serves the functions of getting people commodities they need to carry out their lives, and it may serve certain social functions in distributing resources or power. But as long as the functions of the market and the economy are kind of subjugated to social goals, it's said to be embedded. And so if markets become disembedded, that means the goal of increasing output becomes a good in and of itself, which is, I believe, at least in Karl Polanyi's schema, he would call that bad. And so in this instance, the idea was this kind of liberalization of trade was embedded with social purpose. And so there were limits on globalization that allowed domestic democracy to continue. And importantly, it allowed a great degree of experimentation in different nations. So with the Keynesian revolution occurring in that time, you have a high degree of macroeconomic management, but countries are also engaging in a lot of mixed system sort of stuff, where they're bringing in elements of a socialist system or managed capitalism. And other nations went with a very, very open trade, maybe disembedded approach, right? But importantly, different nations were allowed to experiment and weren't immediately and swiftly punished by international capital flows in this time, because capital controls were a thing. So some other aspects of GATT was that trade and services and agriculture were not liberalized. In part, trade and services was not liberalized because trade and services was simply not a very large part of trade at that time. Agriculture was not liberalized for a couple of reasons. For one reason was that Europe was just very resistant to this. They wanted to maintain a very kind of closed agricultural market. But also, many exceptions were made for developing nations who essentially had a lot of agricultural output. And if it was all flooded into international markets without any sort of quota or limits, it would hurt everyone because the prices of those agricultural products would plummet. So they were allowed some degree of collusion to essentially keep agricultural good prices up to help support incomes and development in the developing world. The most important of these that was not necessarily purely agricultural was something called the multi-fiber agreement. And it sounds very specific, but I cannot overstate how important this was for many nations' development. Because there's kind of, as you look through kind of the history of what nations were producing what, very often one of the earliest industrial outputs that a nation will start producing is textiles, right? It happened in the US, it happened in the UK, but they start producing textiles. And then, as time goes on, textile production kind of falls and different industrial products take their place. And so what we see then in the post-war era is many developing nations are heavily, heavily producing textiles because they have access to that capital and it's an easily transportable and tradable good. Problem is if every developing nation produces textiles at an immense rate, kind of just like our agricultural good example, the price plummets and it hurts everyone. And so there was a great deal of formalized, sanctioned collusion to keep textile prices up to help support development. And so this is one very important part of the exceptions to free trade under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And finally, the last kind of exception was something called the anti-dumping rule. And the anti-dumping rule just states that you cannot sell a good in a country below your cost of production. Because this can have massive domestic consequences in that country. And so by preventing this kind of dumping, you're helping to protect industries in countries by what may be unfair competition by a monopoly elsewhere, right? So this is another way that GATT limited globalization. But that's not the system we live under today. The system that we live under today really came into being It started coming to be in the 80s, but it really was punctuated in 1995 whenever the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was dissolved and replaced with the World Trade Organization. And so this is maybe not like the moment that things shifted, but it is emblematic of it. And this is where we started moving on our trilemma from the bottom to up on the side. We are going for hyperglobalization and national sovereignty while limiting democratic policies. So, what were some of the limits on democratic policies that were the result of this? Lower corporate tax rates globally. Tighter fiscal policy. We can't do as much Keynesian macroeconomic stimulus because people can move their capital around. Deregulations. In general, kind of this neoliberalism abroad, as I've spoke about previously. And finally, there was also a concerted effort to limit the power of the labor movement. And these were all things that help support the profitability of large firms. So in this way, we can kind of think of hyperglobalization and putting us in the golden straitjacket as part of the neoliberal project, but in a large global scale rather than an individual national scale. But the ethic of the time was that regulated markets had given us the stagflation of the 1970s. Keynesian macroeconomic management had failed to fix the problem, and so what fixed the stagflation, in a way, was a retreat to laissez-faire. And so the ethic was that unregulated markets would provide universally better outcomes than states or regulated markets. And if that was true at the national level, it was also believed that that would be true at the global level. But not everyone was on board with this. Before we get to that, we'll talk about the reaction to the WTO in just a moment. But let's talk about some specific aspects of how the WTO changed international trade. As I said, it moved from an embedded liberalism to a disembedded liberalism. Free trade was extended to services and agriculture. Import quotas for developing nations were eliminated, thus kind of eliminating their ability to create infant industry protections. The multi-fiber agreement, this very successful, very important agreement, was ended. And far more stringent rules regarding intellectual property were established. So essentially, developing nations could use many patents without any payment for most of the Bretton Woods era, and that changed very drastically under the WTO era. But maybe the most important change was that the WTO gave the judicial process teeth. So, completely dysfunctional under the GATT, now WTO decisions were final, binding, compulsory, and very difficult to get around. So it's not going to the whole panel of all nations now. It's going to a special tribunal of WTO judges. But overturning the decision requires a unanimous vote of all member countries. So it's kind of pushing that over where like the judicial decision is far more powerful than the overall assembly. And the main ways that punishments are kind of doled out is countries are allowed retaliatory tariffs against people that they receive judgments against, and the WTO also issues fines. Much like how I mentioned in the last class, how the WTO issued many fines against the U.S. In favor of Brazil over cotton subsidies. Another important aspect of this was that nations were not allowed to distribute or were not allowed to discriminate against certain goods. Any discrimination has to be based on qualities of the goods itself and not the process by which the goods are produced. So, for instance, this means that a nation cannot legally, under WTO rules, prevent the importation of goods produced by prison labor, even though they may have moral objections to it. It has to be based on the goods themselves and not on the process by which they were produced. a very important aspect of this exception is something called the phytosanitary standards, and so this is essentially public health. So you can prevent the importation of goods for public health reasons, essentially, if it's an unsafe good in and of itself, not necessarily because of the process by which it was produced. Though there has been some change on that, and I will in recent years, and I'll come back to that. So anyway, we get this disembedded liberalism, and there's a giant backlash. The Seattle round of WTO negotiations were just heavily protested. I believe that was also in 95, maybe in 96. And developing nations were very unhappy with the situation. They were very much pushed back against the liberalization of agriculture because, as I mentioned before, a large part of their exports are agricultural exports, and if all of those are liberalized, the price is going to fall, right? The developed nations have equal votes, but they have more than equal power. They've got a lot more resources to engage with the judicial process, and a lot more, essentially, they can hire better lawyers. And so this was one big reason why the developing nations felt quite cheated by the change to the judicial process of the WTO. So simultaneously, they're getting their kind of special protections that'll help development taken away, and you are less likely to be able to win judgments against the developed nations. Subsequently to this round, so after that, there was some establishment of essentially public aid. So now there is an office in Geneva that provides free legal aid in WTO cases to developing nations that may not have the resources to engage with the judicial process on their own. And so that's helped somewhat. Simultaneously, workers in the developed nations were very frightened by the prospect of offshoring of their jobs. And in hindsight, it seems they were right to be afraid of that prospect because that's what happened. So essentially, workers in the developed world are unhappy. The developing nations are very unhappy about the liberalization of agriculture and the judicial process. And there's just a high degree of skepticism about kind of entering into this golden straitjacket. And yet we do. So, trade liberalization had significant effects on domestic income distributions. Like we talked about last class, essentially the winners keep winning and the losers keep losing. Trade has lowered incomes at the low end of the income distribution and raised incomes at the high end of developed countries. There's certainly a consumer surplus that is also being generated in the form of lower prices for commodities. However, if you think about it, the people with a greater ability to spend at the higher end of the income distribution, they're able to experience more of the greater benefit of lower prices than people at the low end of the income distribution, especially now that their incomes are even lower, right? Trade and services also continued to be liberalized, is also continuing to be liberalized, as, for instance, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is very much about liberalization of services. So if that continues, even more workers are going to be exposed to the effects of globalization and potential lowering of their wages. But it's always important to keep in mind that even though incomes may be falling in the developed world for some people, this has really been a huge boon in the developing world in many nations, because it definitely increased wages and development abroad. So it's a trade-off, and we've got to think about that. And so in many ways, I think this very much highlights that we need to not be thinking about should we have globalization or not have globalization. We should be thinking about what kind of globalization we want, and for the benefit of who. So, pivoting from this globalization of trade, let's talk about labor. Why is there no globalization of labor? I know I keep harping on this, but I'm not going to hammer on it too much more. But we do see that there is no globalization of labor. There are limits on the movements of individuals across national borders, which prevents this. But the institutions to globally govern labor are some of the oldest still existing institutions. The International Labor Organization was established after the First World War with the League of Nations and predates the United Nations. However, it remains very weak. It largely only plays a normative role, essentially defining what good and bad working conditions are and naming and shaming bad actors, but it has no formal power beyond that. It's also important to note that the International Labor Organization has seats at the table for both labor unions, but also for large employers. So it is a kind of a strange organization in that way. But there's also some economic development concerns that are wrapped up with labor standards. So, for instance, one of the ways that developed countries are able to compete in global markets is with lower labor costs. And one of the reasons why that they have lower labor costs is that they tend to have less stringent labor standards and working condition standards. So that's a tension, right? Like, we want these countries to develop, but we also want their workers to have rights. And it's tough to say what the right, kind of level of intervention is. And so putting this in kind of our larger schema of globalization, where nations are always kind of under the risk of capital flight if they kind of increase labor standards, that means that a lot of nations really have quite poor labor standards, even for formal employment. Not to mention the fact that in many nations, the informal economy is larger than the formal economy, and there's no way you can really formally regulate that without kind of bringing it into the formal sphere. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And so because of this kind of failure of labor organization, labor standards are actually often affected by not governments, but by informal networks of producers and consumers. This is best kind of explained through a framework called global value chains, which we'll talk about in the coming weeks whenever we get to production. But I just wanted to highlight it just a bit here. So we've talked about commodities, we've talked about labor. Now let's talk about capital and or money. So if the GATT and WTO liberalized trade in goods and services, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank oversaw liberalization of capital markets, which is kind of strange because that's not really what their formal roles were in the post-war order. The International Monetary Fund essentially served as the central bank for central banks. So it monitored the central banks of countries to essentially look for best practices. It provided loans to member countries that have unexpected balance of payments inversions or problems. And they also kind of worked with governments to change monetary and economic policy. And in that last point is where the IMF was able to really kind of, in the 80s, turn up financial liberalization. It essentially, in this normative role, was able to convince many central banks in many nations that financial liberalization was the way to go. The World Bank is fundamentally a development institution. It was created in the post-war era to provide loans for developing nations and for European nations to kind of rebuild after all their capital was smashed in the Second World War. So they provide loans and grants that deal with public works, education, health, and even some private developments. They also hold large conferences where they provide technological assistance, so this is kind of a more human capital side. But the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, in their role as the lenders, both to central banks and for development projects, are given immense power. And that gives them the ability to influence policy. So In the 80s, along with neoliberalism, there was a great push for financial market liberalization. Um, Essentially, the idea was all of these capital controls were preventing money from finding investments that gave them the highest rate of profit. And essentially, what the IMF and the World Bank were able to do is whenever a developing nation, at the time, for instance, Brazil, was hitting rough times, they had one of those unexpected balance of payments problems, they could say, we'll bail you out, we'll provide you credit, but you have to make these policy changes. You have to liberalize your financial account. You have to get rid of your capital controls. And so in the late 80s and the 90s, that's what ended up getting all of these policies changed in a process that was afterwards called structural adjustment. Essentially, the idea was that the IMF and the World Bank believed that these countries had kind of structural issues in their financial systems that had to be fixed through liberalization. And I believe I showed you a graph about this very early on in the class. It took more than a decade for these countries to recover from this process in terms of per capita income. It was immensely damaging to economic development for many of the nations that experienced it. So just to kind of put this back in historical context, Bretton Woods, we had a lot of capital controls, various forms, taxes, licenses, prohibition. These were all different tools that were used. And then today, capital can flow freely from country to country, and central banks have to keep a great deal of discipline when it comes to monetary or fiscal policy. Otherwise, capital may flee. Because for all those reasons we talked about before, they may expect lower profits in the future because they may have to pay for social programs in the present. Or in the instance of monetary policy, they may be afraid of inflation, which reduces their real rate of return. So, this limits the purview for domestic economic policy in the fiscal and monetary space, which means that by definition, national democracy has to also be limited. Because if democracy calls for capital controls to come back, well, they can't because we're all members of the WTO and we've signed a bunch of agreements with other countries under the International Monetary System, or under the IMF and so on, right? And so that's where we sit today, is non-democratic control of our global monetary system. And the reason isn't because we necessarily have formally said we're not letting that be democratic anymore. It's a consequence of the mechanisms of all the institutions we've set up. And that's capital flight. So if we've all agreed to say capital can move freely, that means by making that choice, have limited democracy. Because if we make a choice that capital doesn't like, capital's going to leave. The Southeast Asian financial crisis, which I believe happened in the late 90s, was a great example of this. It was like a moment of capital flight occurring at the exact moment where financial markets were being liberalized around the world. So we got to kind of see liberalization, immediate consequence, and it stopped to nothing. And so essentially, this means that governments have to bow to the interests of capital because we need capital to be productive. And so if it just leaves, that's very problematic for the country. And this is just the consequence of the institutions that we've set up after the Bretton Woods system. So let's wrap up with a brief discussion about the issue of what's called stolen goods. So despite the fact that we've created these very kind of strong institutions of international governance of markets, we have to deal with the fact that many nations do not have these kind of institutions. And so one issue that is brought up in the reading is this idea of stolen goods, that maybe it's not okay to trade with corrupt governments that gain from selling natural resources in the world market. So some examples here would be Angola selling oil and diamonds, and Equatorial Guinea selling aluminum, petrochemicals, and gold. And so, should we only trade with democracies? I'll kind of leave the thoughts on that up to you, but I would also invite you to think about the question of that democracy is not a 1 or a 0 proposition. There are different degrees of democracy in different nations. And so, how democratic do you have to be considered a legitimate government that's acting in the interests of the people? And who gets to decide where that line is? I've got a strong suspicion that if this did kind of come up in a World Trade Organization negotiation, that line would certainly be set somewhere far, less democratic than, say, China, because China is just such a strong and powerful, important economic actor in global markets that people would not want to define that line in such a way that would remove those resources from global trade. So think about those issues of, should we only trade with democracies? If we decide we should only trade with democracies, what's kind of the delineation point, and then who gets to decide what that point is? Another kind of more broad thing I would invite you to think about is what do you think is the best way to govern global markets? Do you think that the benefits of the hyperglobalization we have experienced today are worth giving up democracy to some extent? Or do you feel like we should move towards some sort of global governance thing or back to some sort of Bretton Woods arrangement? Why are some markets liberalized and thus globalized and not others? And finally, think about the distributional consequences of globalization. There are very negative consequences in the developed nations for their domestic income distribution, but it's worth it in terms of the consequences for the global income distribution. So those are just some of the sticky questions about economic globalization that I don't think have very clear-cut answers. Just kind of think about those a bit and reflect on some of the information in the readings that relates to that. So, wrapping things up. Globalization can come in many different flavors, and it requires a number of compromises to be made. We once had limited globalization, but no longer. We now kind of live in this hyper-globalized golden straitjacket. The globalization is most extensive for commodities and capital, but not for labor. The threat of capital flight is this huge kind of albatross around the necks of governments that prevent them from engaging in a high degree of domestic economic policy. And finally, whenever we're considering what type or what degree of globalization we would like, we need to think about the issue of development and justice. So thinking about both the consequences domestically, but also globally, and especially for the global poor. So I hope this was kind of new to you, and I think that's all I got for this week. Thanks.